Hey guys, tonight we're not sailing on a longship or plundering a monastery. Instead, we're going to pull up a seat by the crackling hearth fire, inside a longhouse in the heart of a Scandinavian winter. Close your eyes for a moment. Can you feel the sharp, bitter bite of the air even through the stone and timber walls? Hear the wind howl, a wolf's cry against the frozen landscape. The snow is piling up outside, higher than a man's head, and the sun has barely made an appearance for weeks. It's a kind of cold that doesn't just chill you to the bone, it seems to settle inside you, into the very marrow. You probably won't survive this kind of winter without a guide, so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing just inside the entrance of a Viking longhouse, a low-slung, turf-roofed structure that looks less like a house and more like a gentle hill with a single eye. A smoke hole open to the grey sky. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and a faint, musky undertone of people and animals sharing close quarters. The very structure of this place, you realize, is a testament to the brutal cold it must withstand. The walls are not just wood, they are a sandwich of wattle and daub, sometimes reinforced with a thick layer of sod or stacked stones. This creates a natural insulation that, while not exactly modern thermal pane glass, is surprisingly effective. This is a mainstream historical fact. Viking longhouses were ingeniously designed to retain heat and shelter against the harsh Scandinavian climate. They were built low to the ground to minimize wind exposure and often had a single entrance facing away from the prevailing winds. As you step further in, your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering down from the smoke hole. The main feature, the very heart of the home, is the central hearth. It's a long, stone-lined trench that runs nearly the entire length of the building. This isn't just for fire, it's a multi-purpose lifeline. It provides warmth, light, and a place to cook. The smoke, you notice, doesn't just billow out the hole. Historians still argue whether Vikings used a simple vent or a more complex system to manage the smoke, though most evidence points to the simple, often smoky, reality of the smoke hole. A quirky tidbit. Some scholars believe that the constant smoky atmosphere actually helped preserve the wooden structure from insects and rot, a kind of unintentional pest control. The floors are hard-packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes and straw, which would be changed out periodically, though not as often as you might like. Judging by the smell, the longhouse is more than just a shelter. It's a living, breathing ecosystem. On either side of the hearth, raised platforms serve as benches during the day and beds at night. The beds are simple, likely filled with straw and covered with animal skins. But look closer. Underneath these platforms, there are stalls for livestock, pigs, goats, and maybe even a cow or two. This is a crucial element of winter survival. The body heat from the animals helps to warm the house, and keeping them indoors protects them from the worst of the cold and predators. Imagine trying to sleep with a few goats chewing on something just below you. It's a very practical, if not exactly luxurious, arrangement. The closeness of people and animals, the shared warmth, is not just a comfort but a necessity. You might scoff at the lack of personal space, but in a world where a single night's frost could mean death, this communal living is a brilliant and necessary strategy. It's a reminder that survival in this era was often a group project, not a solo mission. Every part of the house, from the turf roof to the animal stalls, is a piece of a larger puzzle designed to outwit the merciless Scandinavian winter. As you settle deeper into the longhouse, the first thing you truly appreciate is the genius of its construction, specifically the timber frame. You're not just looking at a pile of logs, you're seeing a meticulously engineered survival machine. The main structure is a series of massive posts and beams, a post and lintel system that provides the backbone for the entire building. This robust skeleton is a mainstream historical fact. Viking builders were masterful woodworkers, capable of felling huge trees and shaping them with axes and adzes into the necessary components. The walls, as we mentioned, are often wattle and daub, a lattice of woven branches filled in with a mixture of clay, mud, straw, and sometimes even animal dung. This material, which sounds less than glamorous, is surprisingly effective. It hardens into a dense, solid wall that, while not impenetrable, does a remarkable job of keeping the worst of the wind and cold out. Now, let's talk about the roof. It's not just a roof, it's a living, breathing part of the landscape. Most Viking longhouses were topped with a turf roof. This involved a layer of birch bark laid over the wooden rafters, followed by 2 layers of sod, one laid with the grass side down and the other with the grass side up. This created a thick, natural blanket that provided incredible insulation. In winter, this would be covered in a layer of snow, which, counterintuitively, adds another layer of insulation, creating a natural igloo effect. It's a quirky tidbit to think about. The very thing you might curse in the modern world, a heavy snowfall, was a welcome ally for a Viking trying to stay warm. The sheer weight of a turf roof was immense, which is why the main timber frame had to be so incredibly sturdy. Historians still argue whether turf roofs were universally preferred or if regional variations in wood availability and climate led to other roofing methods, but they were certainly a very common and effective choice in many areas. As you move through the communal space, you can't help but notice the sheer lack of privacy. There are no separate rooms, no doors to close. The entire family, and often several generations, live together in this single, long space. You can see why they called it a longhouse. Imagine trying to get some personal space with your great-aunt Sigrid snoring loudly 3 feet away. It was a communal life in every sense of the word. The raised platforms along the sides, the benches we saw earlier, are where everyone lived, slept, and worked. They would store their personal belongings in chests under these benches. It's a reminder that their concept of home was less about individual rooms and more about a shared, central space. The lack of private rooms also meant that the entire space could be heated by that one central fire, which was essential for surviving the cold. You'd think a family squabble would be a nightmare, but maybe they were too cold to bother. The benches themselves were multifunctional. During the day, they were workbenches for crafting, mending, and preparing food. At night, they were piled with furs and blankets for sleeping. The furs were crucial, and not just for warmth. Animal hides, particularly from sheep and reindeer, were very effective at repelling moisture and trapping body heat. You can almost feel the scratchy texture of a wool blanket and the soft give of a fur-lined cloak. Everything here serves a purpose, and most of those purposes are tied directly to survival. The tools, the materials, the very layout of the house. It all speaks to a culture that had to master the art of enduring the extreme cold. You might think about your own modern house with its central heating and insulated walls and feel a new appreciation for the simple, tough genius of the Viking longhouse. It's a fortress, a shared haven, and a home. All built to do one thing, keep you alive until spring. The heart of the longhouse, in every sense of the word, is the fire. It's not a cozy fireplace nestled in a wall, it's an open hearth, a long, trench-like fire pit running down the center of the earthen floor. This is a mainstream historical fact. The central hearth was the single most important feature of a Viking home, serving as the source of heat, light, and a cooking area all at once. The smoke from this fire would rise to the roof, where it would escape through a single opening, the smoke hole, which we saw earlier. There are no chimneys here, which you might find a little alarming. The air quality would have been, to put it mildly, quite smoky, especially on still days. The constant smell of wood smoke would have permeated every piece of clothing, every hair on your head, and every inch of the house itself. You'd probably smell a little bit like a bonfire all the time, which, on the plus side, might have been a decent mosquito repellent. The fire wasn't just a simple pit of burning logs, it was a carefully managed resource. The Vikings would have used locally available wood, like birch and pine, and they would have kept it burning constantly. The fire was rarely, if ever, allowed to go out completely during the long winter nights. It would be banked, with embers covered in ash to keep them glowing for the next day. This saves the immense effort of having to start a new fire from scratch with a flint and steel, or even worse, a fire bow, in the bitter cold. This is a quirky tidbit. The role of firekeeper was a serious one, often entrusted to a young woman or an elder, to ensure the continuity of warmth and life within the house. To let the fire die out was not just an inconvenience, it could be a matter of life and death, and would be seen as a great failure. As you get closer to the fire, you can feel its heat on your face. A welcome sensation after the chill of the entrance. You notice large stones placed around the hearth. These stones don't just hold the fire in place, they're heat sinks. They absorb the heat from the fire and radiate it back out into the room long after the flames have died down. You can imagine the people of the longhouse huddling around this central warmth, not just for comfort, but for survival. It's where stories were told, food was shared, and life happened. Historians still argue whether the central hearth was also a symbolic center of the family or community, a place of spiritual significance as well as practical function. The fire's roar and crackle would have been the soundtrack to the long winter nights, a constant, comforting presence against the silent, frozen world outside. The smoke hole above you is more than just an escape for smoke. It's the only real source of natural light for much of the day. A single shaft of light cutting through the smoky gloom. This is a crucial element of the longhouse design. The low light, combined with the constant smoke, would have made the inside of the longhouse a very different environment from our brightly lit modern homes. Your eyes would have had to adapt, and you'd be living on a different visual spectrum, one dominated by the flickering light of the flames. It's no wonder that a lot of Viking life and activity would have been centered around the fire, a bright, safe beacon in the dimness. It's a testament to human adaptability, to how we can create a sense of home and comfort in even the harshest of conditions, all centered on the simplest of things, a pile of burning wood. With the warmth of the fire now a constant companion, your attention naturally turns to the next great challenge of a Viking winter: food. You probably think of Vikings as feasting on huge hunks of meat, and while that's not entirely wrong, their winter larder was a masterpiece of preservation and planning. This is a mainstream historical fact. Viking survival hinged on a summer and autumn of intense food preservation to last through the long, unproductive winter months. You can see the evidence of this all around the longhouse. There are ropes of dried fish hanging from the rafters, looking like fishy necklaces. The scent of them is potent but not unpleasant, a salty, almost smoky aroma. This fish, likely cod or haddock, was a staple. It was air-dried on wooden racks, a method so effective that the fish became hard as wood, able to be stored for years. When needed, it would be rehydrated or simply chewed on like a leathery biscuit. But it wasn't just fish. You can see large vats and barrels in the corners, some covered with hide or wooden lids. These would hold fermented products, sour milk, preserved vegetables, and even some kind of beer or mead. Fermentation was a crucial technique, not just for making drinks but for preserving nutrients and preventing spoilage. This is a quirky tidbit. One of the things they would have fermented was cabbage and other vegetables. Not unlike modern sauerkraut, the fermentation process created an acidic environment that inhibited the growth of bacteria, allowing vegetables to last far longer than they would fresh. It also had the added bonus of creating a slightly sour, tangy flavor that would have been a welcome change from the otherwise bland, starchy food. It's a culinary hack that, for them, was literally a lifesaver. As for meat, it wouldn't be fresh unless an animal was slaughtered for a specific occasion. Instead, most of the meat was smoked, salted, or dried. Large hams and sides of bacon would hang from the rafters, a visual testament to a good year's hunt or a healthy flock. The salt was a valuable commodity, and using it to preserve meat was a primary reason for its high demand. Historians still argue whether the Viking diet was more heavily reliant on meat or fish, as this would have depended on a family's proximity to the coast, their wealth, and their hunting and fishing skills. A coastal family would have a diet rich in fish, seals, and other sea creatures, while a family further inland would rely more on hunted game like deer or wild boar, and their domesticated animals. You also notice sacks and clay pots holding various grains and foraged goods. Barley and oats were common grains, used to make simple bread or a hearty porridge. They would have also gathered berries, nuts, and wild herbs during the warmer months, drying them for medicinal purposes or as a flavor boost in their winter meals. It's a testament to their resourcefulness that every part of their environment was used to its fullest potential. The food you'd eat here is not just about taste, it's about calorie density and survival. There would be no light salads or delicate dishes. Every bite would be packed with energy to fuel a body fighting to stay warm, and you would need every calorie. A Viking's life, especially in winter, was an unending physical challenge, and their food was the fuel that kept them going. Now that you're fed, let's talk about how you'd stay warm when you're not huddled by the fire. You're looking at a Viking, a person who understands that the first line of defense against the cold isn't a wall, but what's on your body. This is a mainstream historical fact. Viking clothing was a marvel of layered natural materials, designed for maximum insulation and protection from the wind and wet. You can almost feel the texture of their clothing just by looking. The base layer, for most, would be a simple tunic and trousers made of wool or linen. Linen, made from flax, would have been a prized fabric, especially in warmer months. But wool was the undisputed king of winter. Wool is a natural wonder. It's warm, it wicks away moisture, and it retains much of its insulating properties even when damp. The Vikings would have worn multiple tunics, one over the other, creating air pockets that trap body heat. The trousers were likely baggy and tied at the ankles to keep out the cold, and you can see some people wearing leggings or leg wraps, which were long strips of fabric wrapped tightly from the ankle to the knee for extra warmth. A quirky tidbit, some of these leg wraps were even decorated with tablet weaving, a complex form of weaving that created intricate, colourful patterns, proving that even a survival-focused culture had time for a little bit of flair. It's a bit like adding a custom patch to your winter coat. Over the top of these layers, a Viking would wear a heavier tunic or a thick cloak. These cloaks were often made from felted wool, which is even more wind-resistant than woven wool. They would be fastened at the shoulder with a brooch or pin, which wasn't just a piece of jewellery but a functional piece of equipment, a clasp that held a life-saving layer of warmth. You might see some cloaks with hoods, a crucial element for protecting the head and neck, where a lot of body heat is lost. Historians still argue whether Vikings wore specific cold-weather boots or if they simply stuffed their regular leather shoes with straw or wool for insulation. Evidence points to both, with some communities having access to more specialized footwear, like boots lined with fur. The final touches, the accessories that truly make a difference, are what you'd notice next. Thick woolen mittens and hats were essential, and the hats, they weren't the horned helmets of popular culture, but simple, close-fitting caps, often made of felt. They look a bit like beanies, really, but a lot tougher. The cold, dry air would chap the skin, so animal fats or oils might have been used on exposed skin, a very ancient form of moisturizer. Every item of clothing, from the inner linen shirt to the outer wool cloak, served a specific, life-sustaining purpose. There was no such thing as just a shirt. It was a shield against the elements, a carefully crafted piece of a multi-layered system designed to keep the human body at a survivable temperature when the world outside was trying its best to turn you into an icicle. It reminds you that sometimes the most boring history, the history of what people wore, is the most fascinating, with the fire's warmth radiating through your layers of wool and hide. You notice how the Vikings would have managed one of the most basic, yet crucial, aspects of their winter lives: sleep. There are no cozy, private bedrooms here. Instead, everyone, family, guests, and perhaps even some of the animals, sleeps on those raised platforms we saw earlier, huddled together in the warmth. This is a mainstream historical fact. Communal sleeping was not just a cultural norm, but a practical survival strategy. It was a matter of pooling body heat. Think of it like a human pile of puppies, all snuggled up to stay warm. The combined heat from a dozen or more bodies would have been significant, making the shared sleeping area much warmer than any isolated bed. The beds themselves were simple, likely just a layer of straw or hay for padding, topped with furs and woolen blankets. The furs would have been a prized possession, not just for their warmth but for their ability to repel moisture. They would have used whatever was available: sheepskins, bearskins, and even reindeer hides. The straw might seem a bit rustic, but it provided an excellent, if temporary, layer of insulation from the cold, hard earth beneath the platform. A quirky tidbit: some scholars believe that the straw and rushes on the floor were a kind of ancient air freshener. They would have been changed out periodically and would release a pleasant, earthy scent when crushed, masking some of the other, less pleasant longhouse smells. It's a bit like a medieval version of potpourri, but with more practical applications. As you lie down, you'd be surrounded by the sounds of the longhouse at night, the crackle and hiss of the central fire, the soft snores of your neighbours, the shuffling of animals below you, and the constant hum of the wind outside. It's a symphony of survival, the closeness of everyone. While perhaps unsettling to a modern person used to personal space, would have provided a profound sense of security. You are not alone against the harsh, unforgiving winter. You are part of a warm, breathing, collective unit. Historians still argue whether the bedding arrangements were strictly familial or if men, women, and children were separated, but most evidence points to a mix of both, depending on the size and social structure of the household. Sleep was also a time to conserve energy in the deepest parts of winter, with daylight lasting only a few hours. The Vikings would have spent a significant portion of their time sleeping or simply resting. This isn't laziness, it's a smart biological strategy. Less activity means fewer calories burned and less need for the body to generate heat. The long, dark nights would have encouraged a more relaxed, slower pace of life. You'd be on a schedule dictated not by a clock, but by the sun. The long periods of darkness and the need for communal warmth would have made the longhouse feel like a giant, cozy, human nest, a safe place to ride out the coldest, most dangerous nights of the year. Even with the fire's heat and the communal sleeping arrangements, winter was a brutal time for Viking health. The close quarters, the smoky air, and the limited diet all created a perfect storm for sickness to spread. This is a mainstream historical fact. Infectious diseases, especially respiratory illnesses, would have been a constant threat in the confined, unventilated spaces of a longhouse. Imagine a whole family, a dozen or more people, coughing and sneezing in a single room for months on end. It's a modern doctor's worst nightmare. The smoke, while providing warmth, also irritated the lungs, making them more susceptible to illness. One of the more unique health challenges was a quirky tidbit, the threat of carbon monoxide poisoning from the central hearth. Without a modern chimney, a smoky longhouse was at risk, especially if the smoke hole became blocked by snow or a sudden downdraft. The carbon monoxide, an odorless and colorless gas, could slowly poison the occupants, leading to headaches, dizziness, and in the worst cases, death. The Vikings would have been aware of the dangers of a blocked smoke hole, and keeping it clear would have been a daily, life-or-death chore during heavy snowfalls. You'd probably have someone assigned to the chimney sweep duty. The cold itself was also a major health hazard. Frostbite and hypothermia were a constant threat for anyone who had to venture outside. Even for a short time, your body is a machine, and in the cold, it has to work overtime to stay warm. Without enough food and proper clothing, that machine would quickly start to shut down. Historians still argue whether Vikings had a higher incidence of bone fractures and arthritis due to the physical demands of their lifestyle in the damp, cold environment. The constant labor, often in a chilly climate, would have put immense stress on their joints, and the lack of modern medicine for a simple fracture could have been a life-altering event. Beyond the major illnesses, there were a host of smaller, but still debilitating, health issues. Skin problems would have been common, from the chapping of cold wind to rashes caused by the lack of frequent bathing and the constant wear of rough wool clothing. Lice and other parasites would have also been a pervasive problem in a communal living environment. It's not a glamorous picture, but it's a realistic one. The Vikings were not invincible, they were human, and they were constantly at war with their environment just to stay healthy. Their resilience, then, wasn't just about their strength in battle, but their simple, quiet endurance in the face of constant, unseen threats to their well-being. With the longhouse as your sanctuary, you can't help but wonder what happens when you have to leave it. Winter travel for the Vikings was a different kind of challenge, a strategic calculation of risk versus reward. This is a mainstream historical fact. While the infamous Viking longships were put away for the winter, travel didn't cease entirely. The frozen landscape offered a new kind of highway. The icy seas and frozen lakes became solid, and the snow-covered land, once a dense forest or a muddy track, became a blank canvas for new routes. The primary mode of winter travel on land would have been on skis or snowshoes. Skis were a crucial piece of equipment, not just for sport, but for survival. They were long, flat pieces of wood, often with a raised toe, used to glide across the top of deep snow. This is a quirky tidbit. The word ski is actually of Old Norse origin, from the word skid, meaning a split piece of wood. The Vikings were likely among the first to use skis as a serious means of transport, not just a recreational activity. They would use poles to push themselves along, a bit like cross-country skiers today, and would have been able to cover impressive distances in a way that would be impossible on foot. Travel by sea was a different beast altogether. As you know, the longships were designed for open water. They were sleek, low-lying, and not suited for ice. They would have been pulled up onto shore, covered, and stored for the winter. But that doesn't mean the water was off limits. Historians still argue whether Vikings used specialized ice boats or if they simply pulled their smaller boats over frozen fjords and lakes, a kind of primitive ice boating. The ice would have created new, shorter paths between coastal communities, allowing for limited trade and communication. The dangers of winter travel were immense. A sudden blizzard could leave a traveler lost and exposed to the elements, with a very real risk of freezing to death. The frozen waters were treacherous, with hidden weak spots and thin ice that could give way without warning. You'd have to be an expert in reading the ice and the weather, and a quick traveler at that, to make it from one place to another safely. But the need for trade, communication, and social gatherings, even in the dead of winter, meant that these risks were often taken. It was a trade-off, the danger of the journey versus the isolation and potential starvation of staying put. With travel so risky, it's no wonder that a lot of winter life centered around social gatherings. While raiding and long-distance trade came to a standstill, the Viking community didn't just hibernate, they found ways to stay connected and entertained. This is a mainstream historical fact. Winter was a time for feasts, storytelling, and indoor games, strengthening social bonds and helping to pass the long, dark nights. You can almost hear the low murmur of conversation and the clatter of dice in the background. Winter games were a staple. The Vikings had a fondness for strategy board games. The most famous of these was Hnefatafl, a game often referred to as Viking chess. It's a bit of a quirky tidbit. The game board was a grid, and the pieces consisted of a single king and a group of his defenders, trying to escape from a larger force of attackers. The rules are a little different from chess, and it was less about capturing pieces and more about the king's movement. It's a game of strategy, not brute force, and it would have been a fantastic way to sharpen the mind and while away the hours when you couldn't be outdoors. But the fun wasn't limited to board games. The sagas tell of competitive activities, too. Some historians still argue whether things like wrestling and tug-of-war were common indoor activities, but it's likely that in the larger halls, people would engage in physical contests to stay active and maintain their strength. Think of it as a Viking gym class, but with more shouting and less lycra. These contests weren't just for show, they kept people fit and ready for the spring sailing season. Music and poetry were also a crucial part of winter gatherings. The skalds, or court poets, were highly respected, and their recitations would have been a main source of entertainment. They would compose and perform poems about great deeds, mythological tales, and the history of their people. They would likely accompany themselves with instruments like the lyre or the harp. It was a time for communal art, for the preservation of culture, and for a shared sense of identity. In a world without books, these oral traditions were the glue that held their history together. The social fabric of Viking society, you realize, was not just about war and trade, but also about the quiet, indoor moments of shared laughter and stories, which were most important during the long winter nights. Now, let's talk about the big business of the Viking Age, raiding. You've been here for a while, and you've seen the preparations for winter, the storing of food, the communal living, the crafting of tools. You've also seen a lot of strong, able-bodied warriors sitting around, sharpening their swords and telling stories. This is a mainstream historical fact. Winter was a strategic pause in Viking raiding and long-distance travel. The very nature of their ships, long, shallow-drafted, and open to the elements, made them unsuited for the brutal conditions of the North Atlantic in winter. Ice, storms, and freezing temperatures made seafaring a death sentence. But a strategic pause isn't a complete stop. This is a quirky tidbit. While large-scale raids were out of the question, there's evidence that smaller, more localized raids might still have occurred. These wouldn't be the kind of raids that sacked monasteries in England, but more opportunistic attacks on neighboring settlements or rivals within Scandinavia. The frozen ground and snow could actually make for a quieter approach, a different kind of stealth. However, the risk of getting caught in a sudden blizzard or having your escape route cut off by a new snowstorm would have made these very rare and high-risk endeavors. And the winter pause was a time for reflection and planning. The great chiefs and kings would use the winter months to plan their expeditions for the following spring. They would gather information, forge alliances, and ensure their ships were in good repair. Historians still argue whether this winter planning was a formal organized affair, with specific councils and meetings, or if it was more informal, a result of the social gatherings and feasting that happened in the great halls. It's likely a bit of both. The same gathering that was full of feasting and storytelling could also be a place for serious strategic discussions and political maneuvering. The winter pause wasn't just a time of rest for the warriors, it was a time for the entire community to recover. The long, hard months of farming and hunting would give way to a slower pace of life, and the physical demands of war would be replaced by the more mundane, but no less important, tasks of survival. The weapons and armor would be cleaned and repaired, the ships would be mended, and the food supplies would be carefully managed. The cold was a common enemy, and for a few months, it united the community in a shared goal, simply surviving until the spring thaws, when the world would open up again and the longships could once more set sail. The snow wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a seasonal truce, a force of nature that brought a sense of quiet and predictability to an otherwise tumultuous world. The long, dark nights of winter were also a time of deep spiritual significance for the Vikings. With the world outside locked in a grip of ice and snow, their minds would turn inward and upward, toward the gods and the forces that governed their world. This is a mainstream historical fact. Norse mythology was deeply intertwined with the seasons, and winter was no exception. It wasn't just a time to endure, it was a time to revere the deities and forces associated with the cold and the darkness. You'd likely hear stories about deities like Ulla, a god of hunting and skiing, who was particularly revered during the winter months. He was seen as a skilled archer and a master of winter travel, and people would call upon him for aid and protection on frozen landscapes. This is a quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that Ulla may have been a more ancient, pre-Viking deity, with his cult being one of the oldest in the Norse pantheon. The reverence for a god of winter activities makes sense in a place where those skills were so vital for survival. You can imagine a Viking preparing for a journey on skis, offering a small prayer to Ulla for a safe passage. The winter solstice, or Yule, was the most significant of these spiritual events. This was a time of great feasting and celebration, a recognition of the sun's lowest point in the sky and the promise of its eventual return. Historians still argue whether the Yule celebrations were primarily a religious festival dedicated to the gods or a more social, secular event designed to lift spirits during the darkest part of the year. It was likely a bit of both. The feasting, the drinking of mead and ale, and the storytelling were all part of a larger ritual to banish the darkness and welcome the coming of a new year and the return of the sun. The word Yule itself is thought to be of Germanic origin, and the celebration was a precursor to many modern winter holidays. In the midst of the cold, there was also a deep respect for the Jotnar, the frost giants of Norse mythology. These beings were associated with the cold, the mountains, and the chaos of the natural world. They were not necessarily evil, but they were forces to be reckoned with, and the Vikings would have seen the harsh winter as a direct manifestation of their power. You'd hear tales of these giants and their battles with the gods, stories that explained the very landscape they lived on. The winter, for the Vikings, was not just a season, it was a living, breathing entity, a time when the veil between their world and the world of the gods felt the thinnest, and they would have felt a deep connection to the forces of nature all around them. As the long nights stretched on, the Vikings relied on something more than just fire and food to keep their spirits alive: stories. The oral tradition was the primary way of preserving history, lore, and culture, and winter was the time when these stories truly came to life. This is a mainstream historical fact. The great Viking sagas, which were later written down, were first transmitted orally, passed down from generation to generation around the communal fire. Imagine being a child, listening to tales of brave heroes, mythical beasts, and daring journeys. With the wind howling outside and the fire flickering in the hearth, it was the original Netflix and chill, but with a lot more wool and a lot less screen time. The sagas were not just entertainment, they were a form of education. They taught the young about their ancestors' deeds, their gods' powers, and the rules of their society. They also served as a kind of moral compass, with stories of honor, betrayal, and justice providing lessons on how to live and what to value. This is a quirky tidbit. Some of the more famous sagas, like the saga of the Volsungs, were part of a larger, shared Germanic oral tradition with versions of the stories appearing in other cultures. It's like finding out a favorite movie is actually part of a larger, ancient cinematic universe. The role of the skald, the court poet, was particularly important during these times. They were the masters of the spoken word, with an ability to recite long and complex poems from memory. Their performances were a blend of history and art, a way of making the past feel alive in the present. Historians still argue whether the skalds had complete creative freedom or if they were bound by strict rules of meter and form. It's likely that there was a bit of both, with a set of poetic conventions that a truly great skald could bend and break for dramatic effect. The sagas also provided a way to escape the harsh reality of winter. When you're stuck inside for weeks on end, listening to a story about a Viking hero sailing to a new, sun-drenched land or battling a dragon with a magical sword would have been a welcome respite. The stories weren't just about entertainment, they were about hope. They were a reminder that even the longest, darkest winter would eventually end, and that there were great adventures waiting on the other side. The sagas, you realize, were a kind of cultural survival tool, a way for the Vikings to endure the cold with their minds and spirits intact. While the men were often the ones celebrated in the sagas for their daring raids and seafaring, Viking women had a crucial and demanding role, especially during the long and cold winter months. This is a mainstream historical fact. Viking society was not a simple patriarchy, and women held significant power and responsibility, particularly within the domestic sphere. In a world where survival was a daily struggle, their work was not just helpful, it was absolutely essential. Their tasks were the engine that kept the longhouse running. You can imagine the scene. While the men are mending tools and sharpening weapons, the women are hard at work. Their hands are never idle. They would be responsible for most of the daily food preparation, including grinding grain for flour, tending the fire, and cooking the meals. The storage of food was also a woman's domain. The drying of fish, the salting of meat, and the fermentation of vegetables were all skills passed down through generations of women. This is a quirky tidbit. Some of the more complex fermenting recipes may have even been considered a kind of magical or herbal art, with women as the keepers of this ancient knowledge. But their work wasn't just in the kitchen. The longhouse was a textile factory in the winter. The spinning of wool into yarn and the weaving of that yarn into cloth were constant, time-consuming tasks. The clothing we talked about, the layers of wool and linen that kept everyone alive, was a direct result of their labor. Historians still argue whether women were the sole producers of textiles or if men also participated, but the evidence overwhelmingly points to women as the primary weavers and spinners. You can almost hear the rhythmic click-clack of a loom or a spinning wheel as they worked tirelessly to produce the family's clothes, blankets, and sails for the ships. The women were also responsible for the health and well-being of the family. They would have been the primary caregivers for the sick and the injured. With a deep knowledge of herbal remedies and folk medicine, they would have known which herbs to use for a cough, what to do for a fever, and how to treat a minor cut. In a world without doctors, they were the nurses and pharmacists of the Viking Age. Their work was quiet, relentless, and a constant thread that held the family and the community together during the most challenging time of the year. The long, dark winter was a testament to their strength and resilience, a time when their domestic skills became the most important weapons in the battle for survival. The long, dark winter was not just a time for adults to struggle and survive, it was also a unique and challenging period for Viking children. While modern kids might be stir-crazy after a few days of bad weather, Viking children were expected to adapt and contribute, and their winter was a blend of both play and peril. This is a mainstream historical fact. Children in Viking society were not just passive dependents, they were an active part of the household economy and were taught the skills they would need to survive from a very young age. Their play was often a form of preparation for adulthood. You might see young boys wrestling and training with wooden swords, mimicking the movements of their fathers. Girls would be learning to spin wool and weave with small, child-sized tools, skills that would one day be essential for keeping their own families clothed and warm. This is a quirky tidbit. Some of the toys we've found from the Viking Age are small, carved wooden animals or miniature weapons, suggesting that even their playtime was a direct reflection of the world around them. It's a reminder that their childhood was less about innocence and more about a long, slow apprenticeship for life. But winter also presented its own unique dangers for children. The cold was a constant threat, and a child's smaller body would lose heat much faster than an adult's. A simple slip on the ice or a moment of carelessness near the central fire could have dire consequences. Historians still argue whether infant mortality was significantly higher in winter due to the harsh conditions and the spread of illness in the longhouse. It's a sobering thought, but it highlights the fragility of life in this era. The children of the longhouse were living on the very edge of survival, and their parents' constant vigilance would have been a necessity. However, the cold and confinement also created an opportunity for family bonding. The long, dark nights would have been a time for storytelling, for parents to teach their children about their family history and their place in the world. The children would be a captive audience for the sagas, learning the tales that would one day define their culture. The winter was a period of both hardship and intimacy, a time when a family, huddled together in the warmth of the longhouse, had little choice but to rely on and learn from each other. The Viking child, you realize, was not just a symbol of the future, but a vital part of the present, a small, resilient link in the long chain of survival. The longhouse wasn't just a place for humans, it was a sanctuary for animals. 2. The Vikings had a symbiotic relationship with their livestock, and in the brutal Scandinavian winter, that relationship became a matter of mutual survival. This is a mainstream historical fact. Many Viking longhouses had a section dedicated to housing animals, often under the same roof as the people. This wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was an ingenious strategy for keeping both the people and the animals alive. The animals provided warmth, and their presence ensured a food supply for the spring and summer. You can hear the lowing of a cow, the bleating of a goat, and the soft rustle of pigs in their stalls just below the raised sleeping platforms. This is a quirky tidbit. The body heat from the animals would have raised the longhouse's internal temperature by several degrees, making a significant difference on the coldest nights. It's a bit like a living, breathing central heating system, a natural radiator that required no fuel other than fodder. The animal's waste would also have been carefully managed, often collected in a pit under the floor or moved outside to be used as fertilizer in the spring. The care of these animals was a daily chore. Even in the worst weather, they needed to be fed, watered, and tended to. Their health was paramount, and a sick animal could be a death sentence for a family in the spring. Historians still argue whether animals were a form of currency or a measure of wealth in Viking society. While a cow could be a form of payment, its primary value was likely in its milk, meat, hide, and labor. The animals were not just possessions, they were members of the household, a crucial part of the social and economic fabric of the longhouse. This closeness with the animals, this shared existence, also meant that they were at risk of the same diseases as the people, but their presence was a constant reminder of the interconnectedness of Viking life. The animals relied on the humans for shelter and food, and the humans relied on the animals for their very existence. The longhouse, you realize, was an ark in the middle of a frozen ocean, and every living thing inside, from the humans to the livestock, was a vital passenger on a long journey to spring. Having seen the longhouse from the inside, let's consider what happens to the most iconic symbol of the Vikings when winter sets in, their longships. You've heard the stories of these magnificent vessels sailing the open seas, but in the dead of winter, they were no use. This is a mainstream historical fact. Viking longships, with their open decks and shallow drafts, were pulled ashore and stored for the winter. They were not designed for ice-choked fjords or brutal winter storms. To leave a ship in the water would be to risk it being crushed by moving ice or swamped by a sudden gale. The process of wintering a longship was a major undertaking. The ships would be hauled onto land, often into a sheltered area within a fjord or bay. This would have required the concerted effort of the entire community, using ropes and rollers to pull the heavy vessel out of the water. Once ashore, the ships would be carefully propped up to prevent the hull from warping or rotting. They would then be covered, often with a simple timber frame and tarps made of animal hides or felted wool. This is a quirky tidbit. Some ships were even pulled into purpose-built boathouses, which were essentially long, narrow sheds that protected the ship from the elements. This level of care and preservation shows just how valuable these ships were. They were not just a means of transport, they were a symbol of the community's power and a crucial piece of its economic and military life. While the ships were stored, they were also a focus of winter labor. The men would spend the long, dark months repairing and maintaining them. Ropes would be mended, sails would be patched, and the hull would be checked for any damage. Historians still argue whether this winter maintenance was a solitary task or a communal effort, but it's likely that a group of men would work together, sharing skills and stories as they toiled. The work was slow and meticulous, a testament to the fact that their survival in the spring depended on the seaworthiness of these vessels. The silence of a longship in winter is a strange thing to contemplate. Its fierce dragon prow, so menacing on the open water, would be shrouded in snow, a quiet sentinel waiting for the spring thaw. The ship, once a symbol of motion and adventure, becomes a symbol of quiet endurance, a reminder that even the most powerful of forces must sometimes rest. With the longships beached and the ground frozen solid, the Vikings' attention would turn from the sea to the land, but not for ploughing or planting. Winter was a time of agricultural rest. This is a mainstream historical fact. The harsh Scandinavian winter put a complete stop to all forms of large-scale farming. The fields lay dormant under a thick blanket of snow, and the farmers, who made up the bulk of the population, would pivot to other, equally important tasks. This agricultural pause was a natural rhythm of life, a forced period of rest that allowed the land to recover and the people to focus on preservation and maintenance. But this isn't to say that all work ceased. The work just changed. The winter months were crucial for preparing for the next year's growing season. The farmers would be mending fences, repairing tools, and preparing the soil for when the thaw came. This is a quirky tidbit. Some historians believe that in areas with a lot of snow, the Vikings would use the winter months to build new stone walls or clear new fields, as the frozen ground and snow made it easier to move heavy stones or to identify and clear trees. It's a kind of winter land management, a slow and methodical preparation for the sudden burst of activity that spring would bring. The animals, as we've seen, were also a key part of this winter agricultural cycle. The farmers would be responsible for feeding the livestock, a task that required careful management of the fodder that had been collected and dried during the summer and autumn. The life of a farmer in the winter was a constant calculation of how long the food supply would last and how much they would need to ration. Historians still argue whether the winter months were a time of widespread hunger and scarcity, or if a well-prepared family could live comfortably. It likely depended on the success of the previous year's harvest and the size of the family's herd. The winter, then, was a time of quiet productivity, a period of gestation. The land was sleeping, and the farmers were tending to the slow, steady work of preparing for its reawakening. The Viking farmer, you realize what's on, was a long-term planner, a person who understood that the bounty of the summer was directly tied to the hard, unsung work of the winter. Their resilience wasn't just in their ability to endure the cold, it was in their patience, their foresight, and their commitment to a long and demanding cycle of life. The long, dark winter was not a time of idleness, it was a period of intense and practical labor, with a focus on tools and repair. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Vikings used the winter months to mend their essential tools and craft new ones, ensuring they would be ready for the intense labor of the spring and summer. The sound of a hammer on metal or the rhythmic rasp of a file on wood would have been a constant backdrop to the longhouse's quiet life. You can almost see it now, a man hunkered by the fire, his hands calloused and practiced. He's working on a broken axe handle, carefully shaping a new piece of wood with a small adze, or maybe he's sharpening a knife or a sword. The rhythmic scrape of the sharpening stone, a meditative sound in the smoky air. This is a quirky tidbit. The Vikings were incredibly skilled metalworkers and woodworkers, and many of their tools, like the iron axe and the draw knife, were multi-purpose, used for everything from felling trees to crafting intricate carvings. The ability to repair and create your own tools was not just a skill, it was a necessity for survival. The women, too, were engaged in this kind of practical labor. They would be mending clothes, repairing pottery, and ensuring that the household tools, like grinding stones and spinning wheels, were in good working order. It was a time of proactive maintenance, a way of ensuring that a small problem didn't become a big one later on. Historians still argue whether tool-making was a specialized trade or a skill that every man and woman possessed. It's likely that basic repair was a universal skill, while more complex metalwork and woodworking was the domain of a few master craftsmen. The cold, then, was not a time of rest for the hands, but a time of rest for the fields and the seas. The work shifted from the outdoor to the indoor, from the large scale to the small scale. from the dramatic to the mundane, but the work was no less important. The quiet labour of the winter, the mending, the crafting, the preparing, was the very foundation upon which the great adventures and discoveries of the Viking Age were built. You realise that a Viking's life was a constant cycle of preparation and action, and the winter, with its focus on tools and repair, was the most important part of the preparation. With the longships stored and the fields dormant, the Viking community had time for matters of a different nature, specifically law and justice. This is a mainstream historical fact. Winter was often a time for legal gatherings and the settling of disputes. The Thing, or assembly, a crucial part of Viking political and judicial life, would often have a winter session. This was a necessity, as travel during the warmer months was often dedicated to raiding, farming, or trading, leaving winter as a time when most people would be home and available. It was a kind of ancient, slow season for justice. The Thing was a public assembly where free men and women could air grievances, propose laws, and settle disputes. It was not a court in the modern sense, with lawyers and judges, but a forum for a community to govern itself. This is a quirky tidbit. The meetings were often held in the open air, but during the winter, they would likely have been held in a large, heated hall or a similarly protected area. Imagine trying to hold a legal debate in the middle of a blizzard. Not a great look. The winter sessions would have been a quieter, more localized affair than the great national assemblies, but no less important for maintaining peace and order within a community. The disputes handled during these sessions could range from land disputes to personal insults. The law was not written down in books but was held in the memory of the law speaker, a person who was an expert in the oral tradition of the law. Historians still argue whether the Winter Thing was a purely judicial body or if it also served as a political gathering for chiefs and leaders to plan for the coming year. It's likely that these two functions were intertwined. A chieftain's power was often a combination of his military prowess and his ability to settle disputes fairly. The winter, then, was a time to shore up that power and to ensure that the community was united and ready for the spring. The cold, in a strange way, forced the Vikings to turn their attention to the internal workings of their society, to the things that truly held them together. With the fields quiet and the seas frozen, the usual flow of trade would have ground to a halt. This is a mainstream historical fact. Long-distance Viking trade, which was a huge part of their economy, was largely suspended during the winter months. The ships that carried goods from across the known world were beached, and the overland routes were often too difficult and dangerous for regular commerce. The usual bustling ports and market towns would have been quiet, a kind of seasonal economic slumber. But this doesn't mean that all trade ceased. It simply became more localized and focused on essentials. This is a quirky tidbit. Some of the more valuable and easily transported goods, like furs, amber, and small metalwork, could still be traded from settlement to settlement. Often over the frozen fjords and lakes, you might see a traveller on skis, pulling a small sledge laden with goods, making his way to a nearby longhouse to barter for food or supplies. The trade would be less about profit and more about survival, a way for communities to share resources and ensure that no one was left without what they needed. The winter pause in trade also meant a time for bartering and exchange within the longhouse itself. A person with a surplus of dried fish might trade it for a piece of beautifully carved wood or a new axe head. The craftsmen, who had been working all winter on their tools and jewellery, would use this time to exchange their goods for food and other necessities. Historians still argue whether this localized, internal trade was a formal system or a more informal, ad hoc exchange. It was likely a bit of both, a mix of unspoken social contracts and formal agreements. The cold, you realise, had a strange way of equalizing things. The wealth of a family in the winter wasn't measured in the number of ships they owned or the gold they had plundered, but in the size of their winter larder and the warmth of their longhouse. The economic focus shifted from accumulation to endurance. As you've seen, winter was a time of quiet labour and communal living, but the longest night of the year, the winter solstice, was an exception. It was a time for celebration, feasting, and the joyous defiance of the cold and darkness. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Viking feast, particularly the one held for the winter solstice, was a cornerstone of their social and spiritual life. It was a time for the community to come together, to eat and drink their fill, and to reaffirm their bonds in the face of the unforgiving cold. The feast would have been a loud, boisterous affair, a stark contrast to the quiet, day-to-day rhythm of winter. The central hearth would be piled high with wood, and the long house would be filled with the scent of roasted meat and the rich aroma of mead and ale. The food would be plentiful, a temporary abandonment of the careful rationing that dominated the rest of the winter. A whole pig or a wild boar might be roasted, a lavish display of wealth and generosity. This is a quirky tidbit. The Vikings believed that Odin, their chief god, was the host of a great feast in Valhalla, and a feast on earth was a way of honoring him and the gods. The act of sharing food and drink was a kind of communion, a way of connecting the human world with the divine. The drinking of mead and ale was a central part of the celebration. These drinks were not just for intoxication, they were a form of nourishment and a way to celebrate. The act of toasting and sharing a horn of mead was a ritual, a way of swearing oaths and making alliances. Historians still argue whether the feasting and drinking were a form of religious ceremony or a purely social event. It was likely both. A blend of pagan rituals and secular entertainment, the skalds, or poets, would be in their element, reciting long sagas and poems in exchange for food, drink, and a place by the fire. The Yule celebration, in particular, was a time for music, laughter, and a general feeling of goodwill. It was a moment of light in the deepest darkness, a powerful symbol of the community's resilience and its faith that spring would eventually return. The winter feast, you realize, was not just about food and drink. It was a strategic social event, a way for a chieftain to demonstrate his generosity and power, and for a community to reaffirm its unity. It was a necessary emotional release, a moment of joy that gave them the strength to face the remaining months of winter with hope and determination. With the feast over and the long nights continuing, one of the more mundane but challenging aspects of Viking life comes into sharp focus: personal hygiene. In a world without modern plumbing or central heating, staying clean in the cold was a serious matter. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Vikings were known for being surprisingly clean by medieval standards. They had a weekly bath, and even in the winter, they would have made an effort to stay hygienic. A historian from a rival culture even once commented on how the Vikings combed their hair and changed their clothes on a regular basis, much to the other culture's distaste. But what did this bath look like in the dead of winter? It certainly wasn't a hot shower. This is a quirky tidbit. The Vikings would likely have used a sauna or a steam bath. They would heat stones in a fire until they were glowing hot, then pour water over them to create a thick, hot steam. You can imagine a small, separate structure for this. Or maybe they would have just set up a temporary enclosure within the longhouse. This steam would have loosened the dirt and grime from their bodies and clothes, and they would have used brushes and combs to clean their hair and skin. It would have been a communal event, a way to socialize while also getting clean. The cold itself was a kind of natural disinfectant. The freezing temperatures would have killed some of the bacteria and pests that thrive in warmer climates. But the lack of running water and the communal living also meant that a lack of hygiene could quickly lead to the spread of illness. Historians still argue whether the Vikings used soap or a kind of lye mixture to clean themselves. Evidence points to both, with some sources suggesting they used a mixture of ash and animal fat to create a basic, but effective, soap. Their commitment to cleanliness, even in the harshest of conditions, speaks volumes about their culture. It wasn't just about looking good, it was about health, status, and self-respect. In a world where life was a constant struggle, taking the time to care for your body was a profound statement of dignity. While the longships were beached and the great raids were on hold, the spirit of combat didn't disappear. Winter was a time for a different kind of warfare, one focused on smaller skirmishes and personal duels rather than large-scale invasions. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Vikings, masters of guerrilla warfare, would have adapted their combat strategies to the frozen landscape. The snow and ice were not just obstacles, they were tactical advantages for a skilled warrior who knew how to use them. Imagine a small war party on skis, gliding silently through the snow-covered forest. This is a quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that the Vikings would have used their skis not just for transport, but as a kind of mobile combat platform, allowing them to attack quickly and disappear before a larger force could respond. The element of surprise would have been a crucial part of their strategy, and the ability to move silently over snow would have given them a significant edge. The frozen ground would have also made some battles a different kind of challenge. A shield wall, so effective on a solid field, might have been much less stable on a slick sheet of ice. The cold itself was a weapon. An unacclimated enemy would have been at a huge disadvantage, with their hands and feet numb from the cold and their breath turning into a cloud of ice. A Viking warrior, in his layers of wool and furs, would have been much better prepared for the conditions. Historians still argue whether Vikings engaged in full-scale battles in the dead of winter. It's likely that they were rare and high risk. A battle in a blizzard could quickly turn into a matter of survival, with both sides fighting not just each other but the elements. But the threat of a surprise attack or a revenge raid would have been a constant shadow in the long, dark months. The Viking warrior, you realize, was a professional, and he knew how to fight in every season and on every terrain. The winter, with its quiet, treacherous beauty, was just another battlefield. In a world without modern medicine, the Vikings had to rely on their knowledge of nature and the wisdom passed down through generations to treat the illnesses and injuries of winter. This is a mainstream historical fact. Viking medicine, a blend of herbal remedies, folk knowledge, and even ritual, was a crucial part of winter survival. With the longships beached and the world at a standstill, the community's focus would turn inward, and the health of its members became a top priority. You can imagine the scene, someone with a cough or a fever, bundled in furs by the hearth, and an elder or a family member is carefully preparing a poultice or a tea. This is a quirky tidbit. Some of the more common plants they would have used for medicine, like yarrow and willow bark, are known today for their antiseptic and anti-inflammatory properties. Willow bark, for example, contains salicin, which is a precursor to modern aspirin. The Vikings would have had a deep, practical knowledge of the plants in their environment and their uses. They would have collected and dried these herbs during the summer and autumn, a crucial part of their winter preparations. The medicine wasn't just about herbs, though it was also about a belief in the body's natural ability to heal. Historians still argue whether Viking medicine was more rooted in empirical observation or in religious and magical beliefs. It was likely a blend of both. They would have performed rituals and offered prayers to the gods for healing, but they would also have used practical, hands-on treatments. For a broken bone, they would have likely used splints and bandages, and for a wound, they would have used a plant-based poultice to prevent infection. The lack of modern antibiotics meant that even a minor cut could be life-threatening, and their ability to survive these challenges is a testament to their resourcefulness. The Viking doctor, you realize, was not a person in a white coat but a wise woman or man with a deep connection to the natural world, even in the harshest of winters. The Vikings found a way to express themselves through their personal aesthetics, and their hair and tattoos were a crucial part of this. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Vikings were known for their elaborate hairstyles and their use of tattoos, both of which were a sign of status, tribal affiliation, and personal identity. While we don't have perfect records, the descriptions from a few historical sources and archaeological finds give us some clues. You can imagine a Viking man or woman, their hair meticulously braided, perhaps with beads or small pieces of metal woven in. This is a quirky tidbit. An Arab traveller from the 10th century, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, famously described Viking men as being perfected with tattoos, from their fingernails to their necks, with designs of trees, figures, and other symbols. While there is scholarly debate about the accuracy of his account, it does suggest that tattoos were a part of their culture. These would not have been the kind of tattoos we see today, but a more painful and time-consuming process using soot and ash rubbed into cuts in the skin. The care of hair and beards was also a winter chore. In the cold, hair could become a tangled mess, and keeping it neat would have been a matter of both practicality and pride. The Vikings were known to have used combs, which were a common find at archaeological sites. They were often made of bone or antler, and their presence suggests a regular grooming routine. Historians still argue whether the tattoos were purely decorative or if they had a deeper spiritual or magical significance. But it's likely they represented something important to the wearer, perhaps a great battle, a significant event in their life, or a religious belief. The personal appearance of a Viking in the dead of winter, you realize, was a quiet act of defiance against the drab, grey world outside. It was a way of saying, I am a person with a history and a culture, and I will not be defined by the cold. Language, like everything else in the Viking world, was deeply influenced by the seasons, and winter had its own words and lore. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Old Norse language was rich with specific terms for the cold, the ice, and the snow, reflecting a culture that had a deep and intimate relationship with its environment. The words were not just descriptive, they were a way of understanding and navigating the world around them. For example, there wouldn't just be a word for snow, there would be different words for powdery snow, wet snow, crusted snow, and snow that was good for travel. It's a bit like a modern skier's vocabulary, but with life or death implications. You might hear a Viking talk about the Fimbul winter, a great winter of 3 years that, in their mythology, preceded the end of the world. This is a quirky tidbit. The myth of the Fimbul winter was likely a way for them to make sense of the long, dark, and difficult winters they endured. It was a cultural narrative that gave meaning to their suffering and framed it as part of a larger cosmic battle between order and chaos. The idea that this great winter would eventually end in a new, reborn world was a powerful message of hope. The language also had specific terms for the sounds and feelings of winter. The howling wind was not just the wind, it was the breath of the frost giants. The crackle of the fire was the sound of life and warmth. Historians still argue whether the complexity of the Old Norse language and its rich vocabulary for natural phenomena were a result of their poetic and oral traditions or a simple, practical necessity. It was likely a bit of both. The words they used were a blend of the mundane and the magical, a reflection of a people who saw the world as both a physical reality and a place of myth and wonder. The language of the Vikings, you realize, was not just a tool for communication, it was a way of seeing the world. And in the winter, it was a way of surviving it. With the long nights and the slow pace of life, the world of the Vikings would have turned inward, not just to the family and community, but to the very landscape of the mind. This is a mainstream historical fact. Dreams and night visions were a significant part of Viking culture and were often interpreted for signs, omens, and messages from the gods. In a world without books or mass media, the internal world was just as important as the external one, and dreams were seen as a direct line to the divine and the subconscious. You can imagine a Viking waking from a dream, and the first thing they would do is try to make sense of it. Was it a message from Odin, a warning from the Norns, or a glimpse into the future? This is a quirky tidbit. Some of the sagas, which we've mentioned before, contain detailed descriptions of dreams and their interpretations. A dream of a raven might be a sign of a coming battle, while a dream of a ship sailing on a calm sea might be a good omen for a future journey. Dreams were not just random images, they were a form of communication, a language that the wise and the seers would have been trained to interpret. The winter, with its long periods of darkness and its close, communal sleeping arrangements, would have been a time of particularly vivid dreams. The mind, with less to do during the waking hours, would have been more active at night. Historians still argue whether the interpretation of dreams was a formalized part of Viking religious practice or if it was a more informal, personal affair. It was likely a bit of both. A person might share a dream with their family or a trusted friend, but a major dream, a vision that seemed to have a larger meaning, might be brought to a seer or a shaman for a more formal interpretation. The Vikings' ability to endure the cold, you realize, was not just about physical strength but also about mental resilience, and the interpretation of dreams was a way of making sense of their place in a world that was both beautiful and terrifying. The night, with its quiet mystery, was not a thing to be feared but a place to be understood. The long, dark nights of a Viking winter were often punctuated by the quiet, melancholic sounds of music. This is a mainstream historical fact. Music was a significant part of Viking culture, a way of expressing emotion, telling stories, and connecting with the divine. While we don't have a lot of written music from this period, archaeological finds and a few descriptions from the sagas give us a glimpse into their sonic world. The winter, you realize, was a time when the loud, boisterous sounds of summer gave way to a quieter, more intimate kind of music. You can imagine a skald, a poet, plucking at a lyre, its notes echoing in the smoky air of the longhouse. This is a quirky tidbit. The Viking lyre, often called a tellyre or a giga, was a small, stringed instrument, and it would have been perfect for indoor performances. Its sound was likely soft and resonant, and it would have been used to accompany the recitation of the sagas. It was a kind of ancient soundtrack, a way of setting the mood for a long and complex story. But the music wasn't just for entertainment, it was also a part of their spiritual and ritual life. The sound of a lyre, a long, curved horn, would have been used for signalling and for ceremonies, while it might have been too cold for a full-blown concert. A small tune on a horn or a flute would have been a way of marking a special occasion or a turning point in the winter. Historians still argue whether the Vikings had specific instruments for religious rituals, but it's likely that music was a part of their religious ceremonies, a way of calling upon the gods or marking a sacred moment. The music of the Vikings, you realize, was not just a luxury, it was a form of communication, a way of expressing their emotions and their faith in a world that was often cold and unforgiving. The long winter months were not just a time for survival, they were a period of immense creative output. This is a mainstream historical fact. Viking art and craftsmanship flourished during the winter, as the long dark nights provided a captive audience and the time necessary for meticulous work. The things they made were not just beautiful, they were a reflection of their culture, their beliefs, and their relationship with the natural world. You can imagine a Viking carver, a man or a woman, hunched by the fire, their hands moving with practiced ease. They might be carving intricate designs into a piece of bone or antler, a material that was readily available and easy to work with. This is a quirky tidbit. Some of the more elaborate carvings, like those found on the prows of their ships or on runestones, were likely designed and prepared during the winter, a long-term project that would be completed in stages. It's a bit like a modern-day artist working on a series of sketches before starting a major painting. The designs themselves, which are often called the Urners style or the Ringerike style, were a blend of animal motifs, knotwork, and abstract shapes. They were a kind of visual language, a way of telling stories and expressing their beliefs without words. The craftsmanship wasn't limited to carving. The women, as we've seen, were master weavers, and they would have used the winter to create elaborate textiles. The famous Bayeux tapestry, while not Viking in origin, is a testament to the kind of textile art that was possible during this period. The Vikings also worked with metal, and the sound of a hammer on an anvil would have been a common backdrop to their winter life. They would have been forging and repairing tools, but also creating beautiful jewelry, like brooches and arm rings. Historians still argue whether the art of the Vikings was more of a decorative and symbolic language or a simple expression of personal and cultural identity. It was likely a blend of both, a way of making the mundane beautiful and of imbuing their world with a sense of meaning and history. The art of the Vikings, you realize, was a quiet, constant rebellion against the cold and the darkness, a way of creating light and beauty in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. The resilience of the Vikings in the face of winter wasn't just a matter of survival, it was a legacy that would echo for centuries. This is a mainstream historical fact. The skills and strategies the Vikings developed to survive the coldest nights of the year were not just for their own time, but were passed down and adapted by later cultures. A testament to their enduring wisdom, the way they built their houses, the way they preserved their food, and the way they managed their resources all became a kind of blueprint for living in a harsh northern climate. You can see this legacy in the traditional farmhouses of Scandinavia, which still use some of the same design principles as the longhouse, like the use of natural insulation and a central fireplace. The methods of food preservation, the drying of fish and the salting of meat, are still used in some parts of the world today. This is a quirky tidbit, the Viking tradition of communal living and shared labour, which was a necessity for surviving the winter, may have also contributed to the strong sense of community and social cohesion that is still a hallmark of Scandinavian culture. The cold, you realize, had a way of forging not just a family, but a people, and that bond was stronger than any winter storm. The Viking legacy also lives on in the oral traditions and the mythology that they created to make sense of their world. The stories of the gods and the giants, the tales of heroes and their adventures, were not just for entertainment, they were a way of understanding their place in the universe. Historians still argue whether the Viking legacy is more a matter of their military conquests or their cultural contributions, but it's clear that their ability to survive and thrive in the face of adversity is a crucial part of their story. The Viking, you realize, was not just a raider. He was a farmer, a craftsman, a poet, and a survivor. And his legacy is a quiet testament to the enduring power of human resilience. The Viking legacy of survival wasn't just confined to the cold Scandinavian north. This is a mainstream historical fact. As the Vikings explored and colonized new lands, they carried their winter survival skills with them, adapting them to new environments but never abandoning the core principles. The Norse sagas tell of brave explorers like Eric the Red and Leif Erikson, who sailed to places like Iceland, Greenland, and even the shores of North America, a place they called Vinland. But these new lands were not always warmer, and the winter survival skills of the Vikings were put to the ultimate test. You can imagine a group of Norse settlers arriving in Greenland, a land of ice and fjords. They would have immediately set to work, not just on building their houses, but on preparing for a winter that would be even more severe than the one they knew back home. They would have relied on their knowledge of food preservation, building with natural insulation, and communal living to make it through the first, most difficult winters. This is a quirky tidbit. Some of the Norse settlements in Greenland eventually failed, and historians still argue whether it was a change in climate or a failure of their traditional survival methods that led to their downfall. It's a sobering thought, but it highlights the fact that even the most resilient of cultures could be brought to its knees by an unforgiving environment. The Vikings who made it to Vinland would have encountered a different kind of winter, one with more snow but perhaps less extreme cold. They would have had to learn from the indigenous people, the Skrælings, about the local flora and fauna and how to survive in this new, alien landscape. Historians still argue whether the Viking exploration of North America was a temporary period of settlement or a series of raids and short-lived outposts. What is clear is that the Vikings, no matter where they went, were a people who knew how to face the cold and the darkness with courage and ingenuity. The Viking explorer, you realize, was not just a conqueror, he was a survivor. And his journey to new lands was as much a quest for survival as it was a search for new wealth and glory. With the long winter nights setting in, the Viking community would turn to matters of law and governance. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Thing, or assembly, a crucial part of Viking political and judicial life, was often held during the winter months. In a world where long-distance travel was difficult and dangerous, the cold forced people to stay put, and the winter sessions of the Thing became a necessity. It was a time for a community to come together and settle disputes, rather than letting them fester until spring. You can imagine the scene, a chieftain or a powerful landowner sitting in his great hall, surrounded by his followers. They would be discussing the legal matters of the community. This is a quirky tidbit. The Thing was a public assembly where all free men could attend and voice their opinion, a kind of primitive democracy. While the powerful would have had more influence, the law was, in theory, for everyone. Historians still argue whether the Thing was a purely judicial body or if it also served as a political gathering for leaders to plan for the coming year. It was likely a blend of both, a place for legal matters to be handled and for alliances to be forged. The cold, in a strange way, forced the Vikings to turn their attention to the internal workings of their society, to the things that truly held them together. The Viking winter was not just a time for survival and socializing, it was also a time for specific rituals and rites. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Vikings, a deeply spiritual people, had specific cold weather rituals that were designed to honor the gods, ensure a bountiful spring, and ward off the malevolent forces of the cold. These rituals were often tied to the lunar calendar and the changing of the seasons, a way of staying in sync with the natural world. You can imagine a Viking family, gathered around a small shrine or a sacred tree, offering a small sacrifice to the gods. This is a quirky tidbit. Some of these rituals may have involved a kind of blood sacrifice called blot, where an animal would be sacrificed and its blood would be sprinkled on the altars, the idols of the gods, and the participants themselves. The meat from the sacrifice would then be cooked and eaten as part of a communal feast. This was not a random act of violence, but a sacred ritual, a way of giving back to the gods in exchange for their favor. Historians still argue whether these rituals were a regular part of winter life or if they were reserved for special occasions like the winter solstice. It was likely a bit of both, a mix of small, daily rituals and larger, more public ceremonies. The cold itself was a kind of spiritual force. The Vikings believed in the existence of frost giants and other cold-related deities, and their rituals were a way of appeasing these forces and ensuring their survival. The ritual of the winter, you realize, was a quiet, constant dialogue with the world around them, a way of saying, "We are here, we are resilient, and we will survive this winter with your help." The Viking diet, as you've seen, was a matter of careful preservation, but the winter also brought a focus on specific foods, particularly those that were fermented. This is a mainstream historical fact. Fermentation was a crucial part of Viking food preservation, not just for drinks but for a variety of foods. The process, which involves using microorganisms to convert carbohydrates into alcohol or organic acids, was a way of extending the life of a food and making it safer to eat. You can imagine a Viking family gathered around a vat of sour milk or a barrel of fermented cabbage. This is a quirky tidbit. The Vikings would have used lactic acid fermentation to preserve vegetables, a process similar to how we make sauerkraut or kimchi today. The resulting sour vegetables would have been a crucial source of vitamins and nutrients in the long winter months when fresh produce was scarce. The Vikings would have had a deep, practical knowledge of this process, a skill that was passed down through generations. The drinking of mead and ale was also a form of consuming fermented foods. While it was a source of intoxication, it was also a source of calories and nutrients, and the process of brewing was a way of preserving a crop of grain or honey for a long period of time. Historians still argue whether the Vikings drank their ale and mead for pleasure or for practical purposes, but it was likely a blend of both. The fermented foods of the Vikings, you realize, were a testament to their ingenuity and their ability to use the natural world to their advantage. They were a crucial part of their winter survival, a way of turning the mundane into the magical. In the long, dark nights of winter, the Viking mind would turn to the fantastical and the mythological. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Vikings had a rich tradition of storytelling, with tales of gods, heroes, and terrifying giants. The winter, with its long periods of darkness and its brutal cold, was the perfect backdrop for these stories. It was a time when the line between the natural world and the world of myth felt the thinnest, and the tales they told were a way of making sense of the forces that governed their lives. You can imagine a family gathered around the fire, their faces lit by the flickering flames, as a storyteller recounts the tale of the Jötnar, the frost giants. These were not just fairy tales, they were a part of their spiritual worldview. The cold, the mountains, and the chaos of nature were all manifestations of these giants. This is a quirky tidbit. The Vikings believed that the mountains themselves were the frozen bodies of these giants, a physical reminder of their power and their enduring presence. It's a way of turning the mundane and the terrifying into something with a story, something that could be understood. The sagas and poems they recited also contained tales of frost and ice. Historians still argue whether the stories of the gods and their battles with the frost giants were a reflection of their own struggles against the cold or a purely religious narrative. It was likely a blend of both, a way of using their mythology to make sense of their daily lives. The stories of the Viking winter, you realize, were not just a form of entertainment, they were a crucial part of their psychological survival, a way of facing the cold with a sense of wonder and a belief that they were part of a larger, cosmic drama. As the winter settled in, the great Viking longships, the very symbols of their power and daring, were brought to rest. This is a mainstream historical fact. Viking ships were not left to brave the winter seas. Instead, they were hauled ashore and carefully stored in the sheltered waters of the fjords, where they would be protected from the ice and storms. The fjord, a long, narrow inlet with steep sides, was a natural harbour and the perfect place to winter a ship. The calm, protected waters would freeze over, creating a kind of natural dry dock, a safe and secure place for the ships to rest until the spring thaw. The process of wintering a ship was a communal effort. The entire community would have worked together to haul the heavy vessel onto the land, using ropes, rollers, and sheer manpower. This is a quirky tidbit. Some of the more important ships, like those belonging to a chieftain or a king, might have been pulled into a purpose-built boathouse, a long, narrow shed that provided even more protection from the elements. These boathouses, which have been found at some archaeological sites, are a testament to the value the Vikings placed on their ships. They were not just a means of transport, They were a symbol of a family's wealth and a crucial part of their military and economic power. While the ships were stored, they were also a focus of winter labor. The men would spend the long, dark months repairing and maintaining them. The wood would be checked for rot, the sails would be mended, and the ropes would be repaired. Historians still argue whether this winter maintenance was a solitary task or a communal effort, but it's likely that a group of men would work together, sharing skills and stories as they toiled. The work was slow and meticulous, a testament to the fact that their survival in the spring depended on the seaworthiness of these vessels. The silence of a longship in winter is a strange thing to contemplate. Its fierce dragon prow, so menacing on the open water, would be shrouded in snow, a quiet sentinel waiting for the spring thaw. The ship, once a symbol of motion and adventure, becomes a symbol of quiet endurance, a reminder that even the most powerful of forces must sometimes rest. Remember that warm, layered clothing we talked about in a previous section, the one that kept a Viking from turning into a human icicle? Let's take a closer look at what was under those furs and heavy wool cloaks. This is a mainstream historical fact. Linen, a fabric made from the fibers of the flax plant, was a crucial part of Viking attire, and its use in winter was both practical and a sign of status. While wool was the undisputed king of outer layers, linen was the secret to a comfortable inner layer. It's a lot like how we might wear a synthetic wicking layer under a fleece jacket. You can imagine a Viking woman spinning the fine flax fibers into thread, a task that was a constant part of her winter labor. This is a quirky tidbit. The process of making linen was incredibly labor-intensive. The flax stalks had to be retted, a process of soaking them to break down the outer layer, then beaten and combed to get the fine fibers. The resulting linen fabric was smooth and breathable, a stark contrast to the rough, scratchy wool. It would have been worn as an undergarment, a tunic, or a shirt, and its softness would have been a welcome relief against the skin. But why was linen so important in winter? It's all about wicking away moisture. Wool is great at retaining heat, but it can feel heavy and damp when wet. Linen, on the other hand, absorbs moisture and releases it into the air, helping to keep the skin dry and preventing a person from getting a chill. Historians still argue whether the Vikings used linen for its wicking properties, or if it was simply a matter of comfort and a sign of wealth. As linen was much more difficult to produce than wool, it was likely a blend of both, a material that was both practical for survival and a symbol of status. The Vikings' clothing, you realize, was a carefully planned system of layers, and the humble linen shirt, hidden beneath the fur and wool, was just as important as the magnificent cloak. We've touched on the children's role in the longhouse, but let's delve a bit deeper into their daily lives in the face of the unforgiving cold. This is a mainstream historical fact. Viking children were not just passive recipients of care, they were active participants in the family's survival, and their contributions, while small, were absolutely essential. Their role was a kind of a long, slow apprenticeship, a preparation for a life where every skill was a matter of life and death. You can imagine a young Viking boy, no older than 10, carefully tending to the animals in the stalls under the sleeping platforms. His small hands would be used for chores that a man might not be able to do, like reaching into a tight space to retrieve a fallen piece of fodder or a wayward lamb. This is a quirky tidbit. Some historians believe that a child's smaller size was an asset in the cramped, smoky quarters of the longhouse, allowing them to perform tasks that an adult couldn't. It's a bit like a modern-day kid being a pro at video games, but with a much higher stakes. The girls, as we've mentioned before, would have been learning the skills of the household. They would be spinning and weaving, helping to prepare food, and caring for the younger children. The knowledge of herbal remedies and folk medicine would have been passed down from mother to daughter, a crucial part of the family's health and well-being. Historians still argue whether children had a childhood in the modern sense of the word. It's likely that their lives were a blend of work and play, with their games often mimicking the adult world around them. The children's roles, you realize, were a testament to the fact that in a Viking longhouse, everyone had a part to play in the shared struggle for survival. They're small, but crucial. Contributions were a powerful reminder that in the face of the cold, a community's greatest strength was its unity. As you settle deeper into the longhouse, you can't help but notice the constant, smoky atmosphere. That smoke, you realize, isn't just a byproduct of the fire, it's a crucial part of the longhouse's design and a testament to its ingenuity. This is a mainstream historical fact, the smoke hole, or Luri, in the roof of a Viking longhouse was its only source of ventilation, and its use was a crucial skill for a family to master. The smoke, which would have been an irritant, was also a kind of natural disinfectant, a way of keeping the air a bit cleaner and the bugs away. The smoke hole was not just a simple hole in the roof. It would often have a flap or a shutter that could be opened or closed to control the flow of air and to keep out rain and snow. This is a quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that the smoke hole was also a kind of natural alarm clock. The light from the rising sun, filtering through the smoke, would have been a gentle way of waking up in the morning, a kind of ancient dawn simulator. The management of the smoke hole was a constant challenge, and a sudden change in the wind could cause a downdraft. Filling the longhouse with smoke, the Vikings would have had to be constantly vigilant, adjusting the flap to keep the air flowing and the smoke from becoming overwhelming. Historians still argue whether the smoky atmosphere of the longhouse had a negative effect on the health of its occupants, but it's clear that it was a trade-off. The smoke, while irritating, also helped to preserve the wooden structure from rot and insects, and it was a small price to pay for the warmth and light that the central hearth provided. The smoke hole, you realize, was a quiet, constant reminder of the Vikings' intimate relationship with their environment, a small, but crucial, part of their daily struggle for survival. We've talked about the quiet productivity of the winter and the focus on tools and repair, but let's take a closer look at a specific craft that flourished during this time, the art of bone and antler carving. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Vikings were master carvers, and with a surplus of animal bones and antlers from their winter hunts and sacrifices, they had the perfect raw material for a wide range of useful and decorative objects. This craft was a way of turning a waste product into a work of art and a tool for survival. You can imagine a Viking craftsman, his hands moving with practiced ease, as he carves a small comb or a needle from a piece of bone. This is a quirky tidbit. Some of the more elaborate carvings were not just for show, they had a purpose. A bone needle was stronger and more durable than a wooden one, and a carved amulet might have been a symbol of a warrior's belief in the gods and their protection. The carving was a way of imbuing the object with a sense of personal or cultural meaning, a way of making the mundane beautiful. Historians still argue whether the bone and antler carvings were a form of religious art or a simple expression of personal and cultural identity. But it's clear that they were a significant part of Viking winter life, the quiet, meticulous work of carving was a way of passing the time and a way of creating a legacy that would last for centuries. We've talked about the longhouse as a sanctuary for people and animals, but in a Viking's spiritual worldview, the longhouse was also a kind of microcosm of the cosmos, a place where the forces of the universe were at play. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Vikings believed in a complex cosmology, with different worlds and realms, and the longhouse was a place where they could feel a connection to that larger universe. Even in the depths of winter, the cold and the darkness, you realize, were not just physical phenomena, they were the very presence of the Jotnar, the frost giants. You can imagine a Viking looking out into a blizzard and seeing not just a snowstorm, but a giant, angry face in the clouds. This is a quirky tidbit. Some of the sagas describe battles between the gods and the giants, with the snow and the ice being the physical manifestations of their struggle. The cold, in this worldview, was not something to be endured, but something to be faced, a powerful force that a warrior or a family had to stand up against with courage and a belief in the gods. The struggle against the cold was not just a matter of physical survival, it was a cosmic battle, a way of affirming their place in the universe. Historians still argue whether the Viking belief in the Jotnar was a simple way of explaining the natural world or a more complex religious and spiritual belief. It was likely a blend of both, a way of using their mythology to make sense of their daily lives. The Vikings' life, you realize, was a constant dialogue with the forces of the universe, and the winter was the time when that dialogue was at its most intense. In a society built on honor and personal freedom, the institution of slavery, or more accurately, serfdom, was a grim reality. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Vikings, like many cultures of their time, had a class of unfree people known as thralls. Their role in the winter was particularly difficult, as they were responsible for the most brutal and grueling labor. a quiet and often forgotten part of Viking survival. The thrall was a person who was either born into slavery, captured in a raid, or had to sell themselves into servitude to pay off a debt. They had very few rights and were considered property. You can imagine a thrall working outside in the bitter cold, chopping wood or hauling water, while the free people of the longhouse were inside by the fire. This is a quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that the thralls were a crucial part of the Viking economy, and their labour was what allowed the free men and women to focus on more skilled tasks, like crafting and trade. The winter, with its focus on survival, would have been a particularly brutal time for them, as they were the first to be put to work on the most unpleasant chores. Historians still argue whether the thralls were an integrated part of the longhouse community or if they were kept separate and apart. It's likely that it varied from household to household, but their status as property meant that their lives were often precarious, and they could be bought, sold, or even killed. The cold, you realize, was a great equalizer, but it was also a great divider. While the free people of the longhouse could huddle together for warmth and comfort, the thralls were often left to fend for themselves, a quiet and tragic part of the Viking struggle for survival. As we've talked about the Vikings' surprising commitment to hygiene, let's delve into one of the most remarkable parts of that practice, the winter bathhouse. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Vikings were known to have a weekly bath, and even in the depths of winter, they found a way to make it a communal and social event. This was not a quick dip in cold water, but a full-fledged steam bath, a luxury in a world where warmth was a constant struggle. The bathhouse, or sauna, would have been a separate, small structure, designed to retain heat. Inside, a fire would heat a pile of stones until they were glowing hot. This is a quirky tidbit. The Vikings would then pour water over the hot stones, creating a thick, cleansing steam, a process not unlike a modern sauna. The heat and steam would have been a powerful way of cleansing the body and loosening the grime that had accumulated over the week. You can imagine a family, or a group of friends, gathered inside, the steam rising around them, their bodies relaxing in the warmth. It would have been a moment of shared vulnerability and a way of forging a deeper bond. The winter bathhouse was a crucial part of Viking life, not just for hygiene, but for health. The heat would have soothed sore muscles, and the steam would have helped with respiratory issues, which were common in the smoky longhouse. Historians still argue whether the bathhouse was a purely secular activity, or if it had a spiritual or ritualistic significance. It was likely a blend of both, a place for a person to cleanse their body and their spirit. The Vikings' love for the bathhouse, you realize, was a quiet, constant rebellion against the cold, and a testament to their love of life and their desire to live it with dignity and grace, no matter the conditions. With the work and the rituals complete, the long, dark nights of a Viking winter would also have been a time for entertainment and mental stimulation. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Vikings were fond of board games and riddles, and these activities were a crucial part of their social and intellectual life, a way of passing the time and keeping the mind sharp. The board games they played were not just for fun, they were often miniature versions of the strategic and tactical challenges of war and politics. You can imagine a group of men and women gathered around a small board, their faces intent on the game. The most famous of these games was Hnefatafl, which we mentioned earlier, a game of strategy where a king and his defenders try to escape from a larger force of attackers. This is a quirky tidbit. The game board and pieces, which were often made of bone or wood, have been found at many archaeological sites, a testament to the game's widespread popularity. It's a game that required foresight, planning, and a deep understanding of strategy, and it would have been a fantastic way to sharpen the mind in the absence of physical combat. But the entertainment wasn't limited to board games. The Vikings also loved riddles and wordplay. Riddles, in particular, were a kind of intellectual sparring, a way of showing off one's wit and knowledge. The sagas contain many examples of riddles, and they often required a deep understanding of mythology, nature, and the world around them. Historians still argue whether the riddles were a form of purely secular entertainment or if they had a deeper spiritual significance. It was likely a blend of both, a way of showing off one's intelligence while also engaging with the deeper mysteries of the universe. The entertainment of the Viking winter, you realize, was not just about passing the time, It was about the cultivation of the mind and the spirit, a way of staying sharp and resilient in the face of the long, dark nights. As we reach the end of our journey through the Viking winter, it's time to reflect on what we've seen and what it all means. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Viking culture, which is often remembered for its raids and its conquests, was, at its core, a culture of profound resilience. Their ability to survive the darkest and coldest nights of the year was not a matter of luck or brute force, but a result of their ingenuity, their communal spirit, and their deep connection to the natural world. The longhouse, which we've explored from top to bottom, was more than just a shelter. It was a living, breathing testament to their ability to adapt and to thrive. The central hearth, the turf roof, the communal sleeping arrangements, every detail was a piece of a larger puzzle, a system designed to outwit the merciless cold. They didn't just endure the winter, they mastered it. This is a quirky tidbit. The Viking word for survival was not a passive term but an active one, a verb that implied a constant, conscious effort. It was a word that encapsulated their belief that life was a struggle, but a struggle that could be won with courage and a bit of a good old-fashioned grit. And so, we leave the longhouse, with its quiet hum of life, its smoky air, and its constant, comforting warmth. We leave the Vikings, not as raiders, but as survivors, a people who understood that the greatest battles are not fought on a field of blood, but in the long, dark, and quiet hours of a winter's night. The stories they told, the tools they made, and the rituals they performed were all a part of this quiet, constant struggle for life. The Vikings' greatest legacy, you realize, is not in the sagas of their conquests, but in the simple, profound fact that they survived. And in doing so, they left us with a powerful and enduring lesson in resilience. Now, as the embers of the hearth begin to dim and the longhouse settles into a deep, quiet slumber, it's time for you to do the same. The journey is over, and the Vikings have shown us their secret to surviving the cold. You can let go of the chill now. The longhouse is warm, and the darkness is a friend, not a foe. You are safe. The scent of wood smoke and the low murmur of the wind are a lullaby. The Vikings, in their wisdom, knew that the night was not something to be feared, but a time to rest, to dream, and to prepare for the new day. So, let yourself drift off. The long, cold night is ending, and the first light of a new day is just over the horizon. You've earned your rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.